aware of the language that's in the agency has proposed for municipal regulation. And I think what would be really helpful is to hear, where you're, if you're speaking on behalf of the farmer groups, where you are, aligned with that. Our understanding is that you are largely aligned. Let me just say that up front. Where you are aligned, and then if there's anything that where you're not entirely aligned, that would be good to know too.
Yeah, thank you so much, dear Chair Durfee. Thank you all for having me back to testify on the municipal exemption issue on behalf of our coalition. For the record, it's Caroline Sherman Gordon. I'm the Legislative Director of Rural Vermont, and this is good timing. We had a chance yesterday to have a coalition meeting to digest the version of 941 that's moving through the Senate at this time. Obviously, we've been discussing 323 all session long as well, and the sections there related to the same issue. Again, our coalition includes Rural Vermont, but also NOFA Vermont, the Vermont Farm Bureau, the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Front, and Farm to Plate, Vermont Association of Conservation Districts, Agrimark and Cabot, the Land Access Opportunity Board, the Connecticut River Farmer Watershed Alliance, and also the American Farmland Trust, who you also heard testimony from earlier this session. So really excited that the Senate Committee on Agriculture has undertaken a strike-all amendment with 941 as it passed, as they considered it in version 4.1. What we heard yesterday is that there was also a floor amendment proposed by Senator Wyhovsky that was voted down, that we were very excited about that. So the Senate voted in second reading in favor of the bill and also voted down this floor amendment. And we think that's all very favorable at this time, because as you rightfully said, our coalition is mostly aligned with the framework the agency is proposing in 941 as it's now moving through the Senate. What I want to uplift most maybe is that they really made a big step towards what our coalition had requested, and that is to back off from those increased eligibility criteria in the RAP rule, Required Agricultural Practices rule. So the version that's now moving does not include those changes. So income threshold for farming is still $2,000, and you can still file Schedule F with the IRS to be considered farming. That is the rule right now, and this bill does not change that. It would also adopt this framework the agency otherwise proposed with the RAP changes in statute, and kind of clean up both the statute and the rule to some degree, to make this legally a more sound approach, where basically you don't see these pretty drastic changes in the rule only, but have them based on a statutory enabling clause, so to speak, that one-to-one reflect the changes that will also occur in the rule. So we think that is more clean and transparent, and welcome that. And so basically my testimony today, our coalition has just a handful of recommendations that kind of further lean into mix matching these two different versions of the bill, how you see it in the Senate version you still have in committee, and the way you worked on it previously, and what you will see coming to your committee now from the Senate, assuming it will pass third reading today.
Question. Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, question, Representative Nelson.
Carolyn, good morning.
Morning.
What we need, speaking for me, maybe the committee, but speaking for me, what I need help is define a small flock.
Yeah, that's part of our recommendations. If I may just proceed, then one of our recommendations focuses on that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So we'll get to that in a minute. But I was thinking I would go through each recommendation and pause after each one to see if there's specific question to each aspect of what we're proposing. Those are all small tweaks. And we also have some specific draft legislative language for each one that we can also look at. I'd be happy to share my screen in the end, if I may, to do so. So the first one is basically to ensure that your legislative intent will be really clear, and that this legislation is not going to pave the way for any local bylaw to have the effect on prohibiting raising of livestock. So Vermont identity includes a strong working landscape and homesteading culture. We all know this. These are increasingly important values as we face supply chain risk. The current global energy crisis is a really important example of that. This conflict between the US, Israel, and Iran, we all know, is disrupting fertilizer supplies, affecting about 75% of the fertilizer used in the nation. And that will result in raising farming costs. So this is also expected to increase food prices for staples like beef, dairy, and produce. Right now, Vermont is importing 86% of its food consumed in the state. And the mandate of your committee's work is to focus on strengthening agriculture, food resilience, climate adaptation, protecting working lands. And so the House version of 941, the way it was passed by the House, would have allowed municipalities to regulate livestock farming on parcels just under 0.75 acres. And during revisions of that bill, there was language that stated that bylaws cannot prohibit farming, but that language was removed before the bill was voted and passed by the House. And now the Senate version allows for local control over livestock farms of up to 4 acres in size. But that bill does not prevent towns from banning, straight up prohibiting certain types of livestock. It also does not clearly define when state rules will apply and when farms are protected from zoning because they're subject to the RAP rule. The agency will be granted more discretion to make a call on whether there's an exemption for farming or not. And the law itself will not spell out how to exercise that discretion specifically. So basically what we're saying here is without clarification, small farms and homesteaders may lose protection and be pushed out of village centers. So while we support the Agency of Agriculture's framework in H 941 as it currently moves through the Senate, we do strongly recommend adding this clause back in, and the clause is, quote unquote, no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting raising livestock, to add that clause in all the relevant framework in 244413 D1 that you will see coming into your committee soon. So again, without this clause, small-scale agriculture and local food production will be weakened, undermining the resilience goals of H 941. And maybe just about that, I will pause here. This is our first recommendation. If there's questions.
So this is not about farming as defined, but about small scale agriculture.
It's
small
kind
scale
of
personal.
It would be kind of both, because what the new framework says is basically when you're smaller than 4 acres, it really doesn't matter if you're subject to the RAP rule or not. If you're between 1 and 4 acres, that's the Agency of Agriculture who can decide, should you be exempt from zoning? Should you just be subject to the RAP rule? Or do they not want to regulate a particular farm? It's not clear how they make that call. It just says the agency has discretion. So it could very much be that the agency would decide, technically you click some of the boxes that would make you a farm and exempt from zoning, but we find you should just be subject to zoning. And then that farm would not be protected from zoning and instead be fully subject to whatever zoning rules they're subject to instead. And a little more complicated it is there if you're just operating on less than 1 acre. Here, the new framework proposes that straight up, you would just not be exempt. You would be also be subject to local zoning. And then it's yet more complicated when you operate farming on any scale, could be larger than 4 acres, when it's about raising swine specifically in a downtown or village center. This is the Orleans case where this new version is designed to have a better handle on it. That case, there's a pig farm larger than 4 acres. And so that's why this new framework specifically has some allowance to regulate swine and swine waste in downtown village centers. Interestingly, in that regard, that bill says clearly there should be reasonable regulations of swine that should not have the effect of prohibiting raising swine. So in some respect, it's confusing because here now raising swine in those very conflictual areas, it's more protected than if you raise any other type of livestock anywhere else when you're on smaller parcels. So basically, it's a matter of coherence to assume the same level of protection, to say even if you're on less than 4 acres and you're raising cattle, let's say you may be subject to zoning. Hey, but those zoning bylaws should just not prohibit you doing it at all. There should be a reasonable standard. Okay, maybe if you really don't have any land base to do this well, you know, for it to be an animal welfare concern from the get-go, because you have like such small square footage that you can't really put a cow on there and raise it well by any means. I think there's definitely an area where also a prohibition does make sense, but in general, I think without that being more nuanced and with the goal of not being prohibitive from the get-go, there's good reason to say it should be more coherent and no livestock raising should be straight up prohibited.
And sorry, just to thank you, Caroline. Just to clarify, are you proposing this for 1 to 4 acres or 0 to 4 acres?
Basically 0 to 4 acres for both of those tiers that are there's 3 different tiers for local regulation. One is the swine waste, where it's already cleared should not be prohibited. And the other 2 tiers are this less than 1 acre. And you're right, between 1 and 4 acres. And we're suggesting to add this legal clause to both of those subsections of the bill where some local regulation is allowed. We say in both of those cases, those regulations should not be straight up prohibitive.
Okay, we'll come back and we can, you know, debate that or not, you know, as time allows. But just any clarifying questions for Caroline before we move on to her next? Yes, Representative Brigham.
So you're saying that if you're in the middle of a city or town and you got a 3/4 or ½ acre lot and the house takes up most of it, there should be no ability to regulate whether they have a pig or a cow or a chicken in the whatever backyard is there?
No, there should be, we're saying there should be definitely a chance to regulate, but the framework you will see that's used in 941 for raising livestock on such small parcels, we're talking mostly about other types of livestock. We're going to get to the poultry part in a section. There's for non-commercial poultry, both bills as passed by the House and also this bill that you will now get back from the Senate have a specific special way to regulate non-commercial poultry. We'll talk about that in a second. So this is about livestock right now that we're talking about, whether it's commercial or non-commercial. Basically, both of those cases are affected by local zoning based on this new framework, because this new framework allows for zoning not so much based on the location of your parcel. So this would apply to whether you're in a downtown center or anywhere else in the state, just based on your parcel size being smaller than 4 acres or smaller than 1 acre. And here I say we do allow for zoning. That's how the framework is designed, but you will see if we look at it in more detail, the framework is articulated about having appropriate land base to do so. So it's not about the number of animals per se, it's about is the number of animals you raise on that particular parcel adequate or not. So every parcel is different. I think No Vermont has spoken to that in previous testimony. Some parcels are very steep, very rocky, prone to erosion, very narrow, have close neighbors so close by that any reasonable setback cannot be respected because of how narrow the parcel is, or the parcel is so steep and rocky that there's no grass or livestock trampling would cause erosion fairly soon. So all of this is complex, and there's any regulation should do its justice to account for that sort of complexity and not straight up ban certain types of livestock. That is happening right now. Very few municipalities do that, but the ones that do it, for example, may not allow for cattle in general to be raised, or pigs in general to be raised, or ruminants, but might just allow for poultry to be raised at all, if any livestock. And we think that's too vague, that's too ambiguous. That's not what we need to foster our resilience and local self-reliance goals. If we want to strengthen our supply chains, what the whole state needs is anyone to engage reasonably in growing some of their own food. As I said earlier, we're importing over 86% of what we consume right now. So anyone who has a significant land base, and many of our lot sizes anywhere in the state are much larger and are sort of appropriate or have been historic farms, and no local zoning should prevent revitalizing the agricultural use, whether it's commercial or non-commercial, on any of those parcels, if it's reasonable.
All right, why don't we have you continue then, Caroline?
Awesome. Yeah, so the next recommendation would be to reinsert a study committee on local regulations of small livestock farms and homesteaders. So what we're talking about, small livestock farming in dense areas, as you mentioned, Representative, that has really been the key challenge in this process to get a handle on that. And prior to this legislation, Act 181 intended really to protect open land with inserting this vision that we could concentrate development in the state. However, that law is now functioning primarily as a development tool, as the law itself lacks any strong farmland protection, and as its administrators also lack any agricultural expertise specifically. So you heard testimony from the American Farmland Trust earlier this session, showing, based on their data, that Vermont is losing farmland faster than expected, over 10% faster than their worst case sprawl scenario, and over 62% faster than their business as usual scenario. And these figures are due mainly due to rural residential sprawl, so development outside of downtown village centers. And no recent law, including Act 181, has done anything to effectively address this issue. So there's concern in our coalition and outside of our coalition that towns may interpret this Act 181 law as a justification to move agriculture out of village centers, because farmland is right there, often targeted for housing development. So it's really critical that we all see this legislation that you're considering right now clearly as an effort to protect the right to grow food and to ensure that homesteading is not undermined by development pressures. So we urge you to clearly state your legislative intent in that regard, that no local rules should prevent people from reasonably using their land to grow food for themselves and their communities. And we recognize, obviously, this bill is also seeking to balance a degree of local regulation, especially in those densely populated areas, with food production rights. And we think that's why a study committee is really needed to keep collaborating with the League of City and Towns. They've been interested and keep working with us towards developing what could become a statewide standard also for small livestock producers, to really make sure we keep working on regulations that will not limit food production, but encourage doing it well. And then also, we realize, and the league also agreed to that, zoning can do its part to protect farmland from development and enhance local self-reliance by setting incentives for people to grow food. So this study committee could also do basically think about regulations, local regulations, zoning bylaws, land use regulations on the local level, how those could be better designed to actually encourage all this and protect farmland, where there's this huge void right now. And then lastly, as we said, the agency will have this new discretion to determine whether the rules should be applying or not. So the study committee could also draft guidelines for the agency, or with the agency's input, obviously, on how will that new discretion will be exercised. So there's lots to study, and we realize this session we're running out of time to get to that nitty-gritty amount of detail here collaboratively. So we'll just need more time to basically keep filling out that new framework we're considering here right now. And I'll pause there. There's questions.
Okay. So we did include language in 941 to set up a study committee or allow the conversations to continue in a formal way. Is that language that we had included in 941 acceptable?
So right now, the bill that you will receive, they took the study committee out. So we would have to put it back in. There was a study committee, as you did, your committee did include a study committee when the House passed the bill. So basically our recommendation is to put it back in, and then we have a couple suggestions to the language of the study committee that I submitted in my written testimony. If we have time in the end, we can look at that.
Okay. I know that we've in another context had a conversation about how study committees can be useful. I know that this particular topic was discussed without formal study committee over the summer and fall. Just noting that. All right, why don't we keep going then? I don't see any other hands.
Thank you. Yeah, the third recommendation is now about the poultry protection. Representative Nelson, this now goes to your question about how to define small backyard flock of poultry. So again, for context, this bill for the very first time in law would establish a legal right to grow food, including plants and poultry, protecting small-scale homesteading from zoning restrictions that is novice. That was not the status of protections prior to neither this law nor this Supreme Court decision that kind of triggered all this. So what we recommend is adding rabbits to the protections, because rabbits can be raised on small parcels, are widely accepted, and do not typically cause any conflicts. Many families do rely on them for food or as a step toward farming. There's no clear reason to exclude rabbits from the same protections as poultry. And so we're ensuring when it comes to the language, the language you will get back is different from how it passed the House. You're right, Representative Nelson, it has this very vague language on a small backyard poultry flock would be protected. So the way the language is currently written, its effect would be possibly causing lawsuits because it's so vague. It's not clear if existing ordinances will meet that standard or not. So it could be challenged in the courts very easily. And then it's so little defined that it probably wouldn't hold up in court the way it's currently written, in the sense that it would actually grant any protections to anyone. So it's basically nonsensical the way it's written right now. So what we clearly recommend, and we know the League of City and Towns we've been in communication with them about how to do this. Because they also don't want this to lead to more lawsuits, and they do want to protect poultry. And I don't think they're much opposed to adding rabbits. But what the question is now how to do this. And so we've thought about this a lot. And what we recommend is making sure through legislation that we will not allow for any limits on animal numbers to be ambiguous, that what they should be are they should be clear, and they need to be also based on the available land, not just on arbitrary caps. And so that would be a consistent framework that we apply, whether it's to livestock on any parcel size, all the way down to the smallest homesteader, that there has to be a relationship between how many animals you raise on any reasonable property size for that purpose. That's what's reasonable, and arbitrary caps never are. So we want to really make sure that it's, after this legislation passed, that it's not okay anymore for any town to impose vague restrictions. such as any fixed limits on hen numbers without linking them clearly to land capacity. The Senate just rejected such vague limits. There was this floor amendment by Senator Wyhovsky that proposed, let's just cap it at 6 hens. That floor amendment said no one should raise any more than 6 hens. Senate rejected it. So similar restriction, a very similar provision is currently being challenged in a court in Maine, where a 6 chicken limit is being argued to violate the state's right to food. That's part of their constitution. And so we want to not have similar lawsuits here. So what the language we're proposing, what it would accomplish is to set clear, well-defined rules that will actually strengthen Vermont's policy and protections and reduce legal risks. So we hope we can look through that language I have in the attachment here to our testimony and explain to you what we were thinking there. We also picked up some of the work your committee did earlier, where you, in one iteration of the versions of the bill, you had a provision in there that allows towns to adopt fewer restrictions, recognizing that most towns actually don't have any restrictions, and to make sure that also this legislation is not going to trigger over-regulating poultry or rabbits when so many towns never took interest in regulating whatsoever any of this through zoning. So yeah, I think it's definitely possible. And then this can also be part of the study committee to make sure those frameworks are all coherent and administratable.
Representative Nelson?
Caroline, I think we need to tread lightly on this so we don't create a war between zoning administrators and the Agency of Agriculture in rural Vermont and this committee. And I think we need to, I really think we need to set a limit of, is it 20 chickens? Is it, and of course, when you're talking poultry, it's all different sizes birds. Turkeys are much bigger than a chicken. And of course, God forbid you get a tom turkey that wants to start gobbling when it's 10 months old. And I teased the committee that we should go by poundage of what a mature bird weighs, 100 pounds, and that'd be roughly 25 Rhode Island Reds and 5 turkeys, because of 20-pound average. But if we could come up with a number that, the towns can't regulate to less than 10 or 20 and put a less than, and then if towns want to let you have 50 hens, they can let you. But we're talking about Winooski and Burlington and Barre, and I Googled up densities yesterday because I was just interested in what Senator Wyhovsky was getting at. And, when you got city densities of 2,000 people per square mile, we have to take into consideration the people that choose to live in the city. And they choose to live in the city for what the city brings. And I'm afraid that if we get a little bit overbearing, Alpha Gamma Row, right on South Prospect Street, right next to UVM Emissions, is one of the biggest lots in Burlington. It's well over 2 acres.
Yeah. No, I get your point. I get your point. If I may respond. So for us, if you want to include a range like the Agency of Agriculture recommended, first of all, local zoning of poultry is not what we don't want. Our recommendation is not to not allow, for any zoning. What we think would be reasonable is maybe to, and you're right, the way that's part of the confusion here, the way the Senate version is of H 941 is written and how it will move now to your table again. You're right. The way it's written, it's including it in this section 4413 D1, where it's a full exemption of zoning. Our coalition is actually amendable to agree that it should be back in 4412, where there's some zoning is allowed, such as setbacks, well water protections, and other just zoning is allowed, but that the framework is no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting raising rabbits or poultry, excluding roosters, to put back in that this is for personal use, donation, or sale, like you had it in the house. And we're not so much in favor of the caps, but if you ask us directly, what is the range that our coalition would propose if you really feel the urgent need to do a range, then the only logical range would be to have, for poultry, it'd be up to 99 hens. Because at 100 hens, you're subject to the RAP rule. And for turkeys, something like up to 50, and for rabbits up to 29, because at 30 you're at a farm under the RAPs. So that basically there's no gray zone between when the farming rule applies and between what you can do up as a homesteader. Why would there be any specific number of poultry, duck, turkey that you cannot ever raise? That is like, is there a specific number of animal in law that the law never allows you to raise? That would be ridiculous. So either you're regulated through local zoning if you have those numbers of animals, or you're regulated as farming. But what cannot ever be the case is that you cannot ever raise a specific number of animals, totally disjointed from you having an appropriate parcel size or not. I'm sure in any city of Vermont, there's parcels of an acre or larger than an acre, or whatever size it might be. But for every parcel size, there is something appropriate you can do with it. And I don't think our coalition is opposed to including those caps that define a clear line between here you're subject to zoning. If you have less than 99 hens, if you have less than 29 rabbits, if you have less than 49, or if you have up to 50 turkeys, I think that it's not necessary from a legal standpoint, because that's pretty also. I think the legal clause we're recommending establish the framework that allows for zoning, but makes it clear like it should not be disjointed from what is appropriate for each case. And that can differ. Also, the ducks in Essex, with what we are suggesting, can be regulated based on, is that particular parcel, what is appropriate to do on that parcel, and not more, not less.
Caroline?
Yeah.
Just want to pause for a second before we dig into the language. I think that's going to be important. Representative Bartholomew had a hand up here too. I'm not sure if it was on the same issue or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually like the idea of limiting the numbers based on adequate land, but I'm looking at the sentence. I was looking at, you actually have it on the screen now. I think municipalities may limit the number of poultry and rabbits anyone is raising only on the basis of a bylaw that requires the adequate land base to properly manage the nutrients and waste of the number of animals raised on the parcel. Sounds good, but what I'm wondering, how would a municipality be able to do that?
So that's why we need the study committee. The study committee would work towards having a statewide model ordinance that sets that standard as an example. We need that standard not just for those poultry producers that are not commercial. We also need that same standard. What is the appropriate number of animals when you're a livestock farm of cattle on less than 1 acre? How many cattle can you raise on less than 1 acre? How many ruminants can you raise on up to 4 acres? you know, so we will need that standard. What is appropriate land base? What is a stocking density key to apply on different types of parcels based on the specific circumstances of that parcel, whether it's shape of the parcel, whether it's ecological preconditions of the parcel. We talked about slope. We talked about rocks, high bedrock, or and stuff like that. So we realized none of that. We have the time here in this session to get to that amount of detail. That's often how the law works, is to set a general framework through these really more general legal clauses, and then to institute something like a study committee where different interests can be represented at the table, and to come up with something that's a model ordinance that towns then can adopt, that you guys at the legislature could read. It would be reported back to you, and you as the legislature could codify it or make it a mandate to towns that do want to zone this to adopt the model ordinance and don't go stricter than that, or you know, make that a statewide standard. So we could continue this discussion based on the report of the study committee next year. And if your committee doesn't want to act on it, towns could voluntarily adopt the model ordinance, as well as there could be guidance by the Agency of Agriculture for how they enforce their discretion when they will apply the RIP rule and fully exempt a farming operation from zoning or not. If that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
So when you're talking about regulating the numbers based on the land base, I mean, in these towns, like in my town of St. Albans City, there's regulations on poultry, but no roosters. I mean, these birds are gonna, or rabbits are gonna have to be in cages, right? I mean, they can't be free ranging all over the street. And I
Right.
think that's the concern of a number of municipalities is, you know, how do you come up with that number? If they're caged, or are you gonna have a net around your lawn and they're running free?
Right.
That's a lot of speculation there.
Right. So this framework would not be prohibitive to a town exercising through zoning requirements for sufficient enclosure, adequate fencing, preventing animals running at large. None of that is prohibitive to having the opportunity to raise livestock or poultry. That would all be permissible under a framework like that. Maybe even more so clearly permissible than it is now. You're right. There will have to be specific numbers also for cage systems. This is something I testified about in the House Environment Committee when there was the discussion also about animal numbers on less than 1 acre. In fact, if you read any animal husbandry book about raising poultry, I right now myself read a book about raising poultry, and actually it's the most common type of raising poultry in a cage system, especially if you're doing commercial farming. So interestingly, on less than 1 acre, if you do it commercially, you could raise over 14,000 hens in a cage system on less than 1 acre. So I testified to the House Environment Committee, you know, that if you don't make those farms smaller than 1 acre subject to our water quality regulations, that what we're basically creating here is a exemption for industrial farming of large poultry farms on less than 1 acre with over 14,000 laying hens that are not subject to any rules. So that would be a problem. For turkeys, it's 7,000 turkeys in a cage system on less than 1 acres. So yes, that could all be defined, and certainly the local regulations could deem it inappropriate to raise that number of birds in a cage system on such small acreage.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, Carolyn, I'm trying to wrap my head around 1 acre parcel. But we seem to be, I'm assuming there is a house, possibly a garage, possibly a driveway, a well, a tree, maybe some landscape. So that alone takes up arguably 25% of 1 acre, for 43,000 plus square feet. So are those statistics of 14,000 caged hens in a household parcel, or just a non-improved,
Non-improved. So the language that was previously considered did not spell out what type of parcel we're talking about. When we're talking about parcels smaller than 4 acres, it could be any type. It could be any type of parcel. And so this framework of adequate land base, that's why it's good not to hash this out with the legislature on this level, because you're right. Those are all important considerations to factor in a stocking density rule or standard. It's like, what is the actual land base available just to raise the livestock on the property? And I think what our concern is not so much this ambiguous standard of on less than 1 acre, you should be subject to zoning. Our concern is that most parcels in Vermont are larger than 1 acre. Most parcels in Vermont, even in downtown village centers, might be 2 acres, might be larger than 2 acres. And you're right, maybe 25% of the properties have infrastructure on them and don't define per se the land base available for raising livestock. But why in the world would anyone prohibit anyone to raise on their property that they own an appropriate number of livestock when the law itself doesn't even ask how large is the specific property, doesn't even ask how much land base is available for the number of animals you're raising. Just put a blanket, ambiguous standard on less than 1 acre. Towns can prohibit and tell you what to do or not to do. Just do a blanket, ambiguous standard. You should never raise more than 6 hens. The family in Maine has 4 or 5 children. They say with 6 hens, they cannot feed their family with less than with 6 hens. So who is to tell how many eggs your family should consume, or how much surplus eggs you want to sell to make the chickens pay for themselves? If you have a property that sustains that.
Good, I go right.
Carolyn, I agree that a study committee probably is necessary when you start thinking about all the thoughtfulness, say, that goes into the wraps. For example, this sort of sub-wrap homesteading farming. I just thought, what happens with, say, a rental farm? You know, somebody lives in a rental with no land, but they're friends with a neighbor who has some land. And would that, you know, include the same sort of provisions that are in the wraps, that the person who's renting that land for agriculture, you know, it's considered their farm essentially, or their homestead. So all those kind of details, and even this discussion about hens, you know, just looking at a Jersey Giant is 10 pounds and a Japanese Bantam is 1. So there's even with hens, there's an enormous range of size and production.
Yeah, I appreciate that thinking. Yeah.
Caroline, I just want to go back to the what a town could do to, for example, contain chickens. You mentioned fencing. The language that you had up on the screen a moment ago.
Oh yeah, I can put it back up.
Yep. Talked about would give municipalities to regulate only. Oh wait till you've got it up.
Oh.
Only on the basis of land base to properly manage nutrients and waste. So how does a fence fit into that construct?
Well, what this, and maybe this would be a question for legal counsel if I'm interpreting this language we drafted ourselves correctly. What this clause is trying to get at, that if a bylaw is seeking to limit the number of poultry and animals, they can only do that on the basis of a law that at the very minimum is not exclusive. It doesn't say it shouldn't regulate anything else. But if you're talking about limiting the numbers, then they cannot do that just in an ambiguous way, but they can only do that on the basis of a requirement around what is the adequate land base. So this is a general clause just talking about if you want to limit animal numbers, you can do that, but it has to be jointed with what is the adequate land base. So this does not say outside of that, you can't do anything else in bylaw. That would be accomplished by putting this clause not in 4413D1, where it's about general exemption from zoning bylaws, but in 4412, where it says you can do bylaws. It should just not have the effect of prohibiting. So this is basically saying sentence 1, you can do bylaw, whatever you want, including the fence, but none of the bylaw should have the effect that you're actually prohibiting it. Then sentence 2 is saying like, okay, if you want to limit the number, you can only do that if there's a requirement that defines the land base. And then the third sentence is saying, hey, you can also adopt a bylaw about rabbits and poultry. In general, that's less restrictive. So this is basically the Burlington case. The League of City and Towns is always bringing up Burlington, that they have a very lax zoning bylaw for poultry, that they basically just say you have to have a coop. The chickens have to have safe enclosure. And they don't really say much about what the coop needs to look like. So this is basically saying it's fine. You can do that. You're not specifying the number of poultry you can have in Burlington. That's fine too. You can do that. You don't have to specify the numbers if you don't want to.
Okay.
And obviously requiring a chicken coop is also not prohibitive, right? So that's
Okay.
basically the answer.
So, all right, good. So that's your intent. Setbacks could also fit into that framework.
Yes.
I
Yes,
mean,
of course, there's a little bit tricky sometimes. We've discussed it very vaguely. The most strict setbacks can be so lack so much ground truthing that if you consider all the very nitty gritty over excessive setbacks, in the end, there's nothing left to ever do anything on the property. So weaponize setbacks to a degree that it would, in the end, no one can do anything on the property would also not be okay. That would be then falling into the sphere of functionally prohibiting the raising, feeding, or management of rabbits and poultry. But most commonly, if you do setbacks also in a reasonable way, it should not be an issue to have zoning setbacks under this clause.
I'm thinking of the 2-acre lot in, or say even an acre lot, a large lot, unimproved, or a lot that has a lot of open space that's in a built-up environment, in an urban or residential environment, where the neighboring lots might be much smaller, and unlike a parcel out in a rural area in the countryside, your neighbor isn't as likely to be living right up on the edge of the common boundary. And in that instance, I think reasonably for a municipality being able to, involve some setbacks makes some sense. Representative O'Brien.
Chair, I was just wondering how we worked out this with accessory on-farm business, same sort of thing, like there potentially could be setbacks for a business, but you couldn't we couldn't weaponize it in such a way that you prohibit that with municipal zoning, right?
Yeah.
So somehow we threaded the needle there.
Yeah, the language there, and we'd have to look at it, but it talks about not prohibiting, so effectively not
Similar in
weaponizing
some
it.
ways, yeah.
Yep. And I don't know whether there've been any, well, we know there have been some high-profile lawsuits around accessory on-farm businesses, but I don't know if they've been.
Setback related.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're right. This is thank you so much, Representative O'Brien. That's exactly what we've been thinking too. This kind of clause has worked with accessory on-farm businesses. We wish there would be a coherence there too, that the intent of the legislature can be clear. We want people to raise poultry. It should be reasonable what they do based on the land they have available. We don't want towns just to prohibit because they can. And that there needs to be a more balanced middle ground on all of this. And you're right, the accessory on-farm business part of the statute in Title 24 lends itself to copy that model here as well.
Representative Nelson.
Thank you. I think we gotta be real careful threading the needle on this. Because I don't want us to do something that makes people in those built up areas, high density housing areas, downtowns. I don't want to do something that makes them hate us. And, you know, I think you can be reasonable and put a number on chickens, on poultry. And it wouldn't be 100. It'd be way less. I think you could do something reasonable to say the town can't prohibit you from having 24. But I think if you start going to 99 and start talking cattle, I'm not familiar with goats or sheep, but I'm familiar with bigger ruminants, including bison. And if we overstep our bounds, there might be legislation coming in here next year that we don't like and may not be able to stop. And that's my concern. And so I think we gotta thread a needle here and be reasonable to our urban constituents. And I don't really have any set. Derby line is at 900 and something people per square mile, with all kinds of old barns still attached to houses and whatnot.
Well, if
Caroline.
I may, one
Yeah, go ahead.
response to that concern of the urban population. One law that most recently also passed into law a couple of years ago is the environmental justice policy of Vermont. And that law specifically talks about populations needing to share equitable benefits and burdens when it comes to environmental benefits, and how that framework is being interpreted when it comes to urban centers is actually quite the opposite, Representative Nelson, that we actually, especially now at a time where we're planning to more densely develop our existing urban centers, that what we're really running into here is not the question of those people and populations in urban centers not wanting anything natural in their purview. Quite the opposite is true, is that we have to make sure that the way we're developing urban centers is that we're not creating environmental justice populations. And when would we be creating such populations? Is when we would strip everything that's agricultural out of those communities, or not also ensure that we're incentivizing bringing food and food cultivation practices into those urban centers. So quite the opposite is true, is what our coalition would argue, is especially the Land Access and Opportunity Board is an expert on this issue, is we need to ensure our urban centers will be having also green parts in it, whether that is tree lines and on walkways, whether that is community gardens in walking distance, whether that is a space where anyone living in an apartment can grow their own vegetable garden or also raise their own chickens. I come from Berlin City. In Berlin City in the 70s, architects have made an effort to patchwork the entire city and many other cities in Berlin with Strebergartens, which is like homestead-sized garden lots where you can raise poultry and vegetables for your self-sufficiency purposes. Those gardens are everywhere in Germany. In the United States, we had after Second World War victory gardens, where because of the supply chain disruptions of the war, people started raising food in masses anywhere they could. So if we want to avoid, in whether it's in response to climate change or other ongoing wars right now, people to be disadvantaged because they live urban, then we need to ensure rights like this are protected, especially in urban centers, so that anyone in Vermont, whether you have the privilege of living on a 2-acre lot with a residential home or not, you are a tenant in an apartment, you have the same right. You can provide to grow some of your own food, whether it's protein that's available to you year round because it's poultry, or whether it's a fiber-based vegetable.
Caroline, just in the interest of making sure that we do have a bill that we can get through across the finish line, you've mentioned 3 changes, I think, here to, I don't know if there are any others, but generally 3 changes. Are you confident that have you had conversations with the other 2 parties, in particular the Agency of Agriculture, on these?
Yeah, I mean, this last issue around non-commercial poultry and rabbits, the agency is really indifferent about. This is an area where they don't want to have jurisdiction, so they also don't really want to be lead authoring legislation on that subject matter. The League of City and Towns, very positive. We've discussed the language I've just shared with you. They have not endorsed or opposed this specific language, but they've been very positive in reassuring us that they do want to settle on this. They do want to bring this home with this bill, a protection specifically for raising poultry. They keep reiterating no municipality in Vermont is prohibiting poultry. And they also said the way it's currently written as small backyard flock makes no sense.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Thank you.
The last.
Question.
Oh, sorry.
Well, one other question, Representative O'Brien.
Just a quick inquiry, but wasn't there some language about mediation also in early versions of this? Like, it seems like most of this is never gonna come up, right? As far as disputes go, and it's the rare case like in Orleans or Essex Junction, where it seems like they're agricultural mediators, and it seems we should take advantage of them and somehow include it. Maybe the study committee could look into this too, but I think a lot of resolution could happen at that mediation level before lawsuits happen.
That is an idea, and maybe I'm sure it's a issue that brings its own degree of complexity, because you're right, we have this free ag mediation service, but if we would want to expand their services to capture non-commercial farming activities, it might come with an appropriation or other support for them being able to do that. I think here what we think is the best way to avoid lawsuits is to have a clear, transparent, well-defined, administrable statewide standard, and the model ordinance could achieve that. Clear guidelines the Agency of Agriculture is going by when they make their determinations could achieve that. So yes, I think you're right. The study committee process could look also into that and fold some recommendations with that respect into their report. So yeah, appreciate that thought. And the last 2 recommendations, I'll keep this really brief. The Senate version of 941 includes a sentence about the right to grow plants not being applicable to growing cannabis. Our coalition knows cannabis cultivation is already regulated by state law, including limits on plant numbers for personal use. I think if you grow recreational cannabis, no one can grow more than 2 plants that are mature and 4 plants that are immature. There's statewide law that defines that, and there's enforcement of that. Obviously possible. So this language in 941 that basically would allow municipalities to circumvent state law and prohibit cannabis cultivation. We recommend removing this provision so that this bill aligns with the existing state law and with the bill as passed by the House earlier. So we know this language could pass the House without that language in it. And we really urge you to do that again, because regulating cannabis, as you all know, has been complicated enough, is really a struggle right now. So we don't need to bring municipalities into that mix more, is what we recommend. And then the last recommendation is to support $1.6 million in funding for the Land Access and Opportunity Board. This is not with this bill, but the LAOB is part of our coalition, and they do really need sufficient funding to take on new responsibilities created by legislation this year. So we really kindly request that you, as individual representatives, support adding 1.6 million in one-time funds to their existing baseline funding. We think there's opportunity to get that funding into S278. That's the miscellaneous cannabis bill. That would bring their total appropriation to $2.7 million. And that would really, based on what they told me yesterday, support them in taking on new responsibilities. So possibly they would, our language recommendation that's included in our written testimony suggests that it should be the LAOB that's facilitating the stakeholder group, not the Agency of Agriculture, because the Agency of Agriculture has testified that they don't want to be facilitating the stakeholder group on small livestock farms. And that makes sense because, well, they don't want to have jurisdiction over them anymore. And this new framework that's coming over would accomplish that. So why would they be the one then facilitating a stakeholder group that then tries to figure out what should be the scope of local control of livestock farms? They can certainly be invited to be participating in that, and maybe they will, but why would they be poised to facilitate that process? Whereas the Land Access and Opportunity Board really has a germane mandate to make sure any type regulations are equitable and don't disenfranchise migrant communities or historically marginalized populations, and urban populations would certainly be populations within urban communities would certainly fall within their scope of oversight. And so they will be better positioned to facilitate such a stakeholder group. But if they do that, then they would also need a budget to allow them to do that. And that's one thing they're tasked with possibly this year. They're also in conversation to working on Act 181 and better community engagement on that avenue. So they have shown up in community engagement processes in the past with phenomenal services, and we want them to do more of that. And so that kind of additional one-time funding is what they say they need to do all this well, and possibly 278 would be the vehicle to get that done. So we ask for your support. Thank you. I will close there. Thank you all so much for your time. I know we talked a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. Before we let you go, I wanted to address your fourth recommendation on the cannabis language. I think our intent, and I can't speak to the impact of what the Senate language would mean or imply, but our intent was certainly to make sure that anything we did here didn't conflict with existing state law regarding cannabis. Either create more opportunity or remove any current opportunity. We want it to be completely neutral on that. So we'll make sure that whatever the language is, and I think what the language we had in our House version accomplished that, I think. And it sounds like you're supporting that.
Exactly.
One other thing that hasn't come up, and Representative Burt, who had to step out, is back now, has suggested that we think about removing or prohibiting municipalities from charging residents a fee for having poultry. And we know that there are some instances where poultry is currently being regulated on a backyard basis where there is a fee. Would you have a position on that? And I'm putting you on the spot because unless you heard the discussion earlier, you didn't know we were thinking about it.
Right now, that does come a little bit at a surprise. I can't say that we have a coalition position on this. I think the legal clause we're proposing is that no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting raising poultry or rabbits. That clause could be a catch-all to rule out fees that are so excessive that you wouldn't be able to afford doing it because there's an annual fee, let's say, so excessively high that it takes away any economic sense in starting the endeavor. So a fee that's unreasonably high would probably fail based on a legal clause like that. But if it's like an administrative sort of registration fee so that a municipality can even like know where there's what number of poultry in their community and there's some administrative cost to that, similarly to how you have to register any working dog or dog you keep in the neighborhood, that is, what do I pay for all 3 dogs? I think like $17 a year or something. I wouldn't see why we would be opposed to offsetting administrative costs, and especially in urban centers, where there might be, in order to manage and apply, for example, such a stocking density standard that's going to be developed on a parcel by parcel, case by case basis. I could imagine that municipalities might choose for flocks to be registered in the town and that there will be an administrative fee associated with that.
Okay. Question? Yeah.
Yeah. So Carolyn, I just wanted to clarify. I've heard you say a couple times in the testimony today about the right to grow food. And we actually passed a bill called the right to grow vegetables. But then when I heard your delineated numbered recommendations, I don't think the right to grow food was one of those. Was it, or was it not? Because when you were going through the numbers, I didn't hear it.
So thank you so much for that question. Yeah, when we talk about the right to grow food in this context, it's about creating these new legal protections for non-commercial growing of plants or rabbits or poultry that have not previously been protected from zoning bylaws because they never were like commercial farming. So this is why we talk about the right to grow food in that context, because here this bill would now protect for the first time in law these 3 things: growing plants, rabbits, or poultry, if you follow these recommendations. Obviously, in the statute itself, it wouldn't say right to grow food because that would not be specific enough. So the language for that reason, the language you saw would be this specific legal clause around growing plants, and then the other specific legal clause around growing rabbits and poultry that we discussed. And it's different from the bill you passed that's about the right to grow vegetable gardens, because that's not about zoning bylaws, but it's also very important. It's about tenant property owner relationships and the ability to grow vegetables when you're a tenant. So I think I think it's great. And I think those legislative initiatives will go hand in hand, and we hope that they all succeed in passing into law, and really appreciate all your work you did on the right to grow vegetable gardens. And also, just to wrap that up, what we really think is the exciting moment of this issue coming to you this year in the legislature is, Maine already foraged ahead and amended really their constitution to have this right to food in it. And the right to food, that framework is broader than the right to grow food. In the constitutional amendment that Maine did, the right to food encompasses both the ability to access space to grow your own food, whether you own the land or not. We talked about that a little bit when it came to environmental justice populations. It also includes the right to be provided culturally appropriated food, whether you grow it yourself or you just need to have opportunity to access food to be eating. So that sovereignty constitution that mandate is broader, but obviously doing a constitutional amendment is very, very complicated, and Maine worked on this for many years. I think in Vermont, the legislative process to amend our constitution would mean we'd have to pass it into law twice in 2 different biennias. Then every citizen of Vermont can vote on it directly during a general election. And then maybe it becomes part of the Constitution. So it's a reiterative process that's utmost complicated. And isn't it fascinating that you all in this legislative session could affect statutory changes like the ones we're discussing today, and basically get Vermont to a very similar place like the place Maine is in right now by having done this constitutional amendment when it comes to the right to grow food. So I think that's a huge opportunity you all have right now, and that these statutory changes we're discussing here today chart the way towards that.
All right, I think that's a good place to stop. And thank you for joining us, Caroline.
Thank you all so much for having me.
We'll be continuing the discussions.
Yes, and please feel free to invite any other of our coalition partners in to give you more of their nuance and spiel. But we did have a meeting yesterday, and the recommendations I shared with you today are endorsed by our coalition. So thank you so much for having me.
All right, we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Bye.
Let's take a break, and we'll start up again at 11.